Welcome to First Line Compliance's Carefully Off the Cuff.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. I'm Josh.
And I'm Ray at First Line Compliance. Today, we're going to be talking about licensing, license renewals, and some kind of attributes around licensing we probably should update you on as we're going through the process these days. As we know, it's renewal season, as it were. So we have to be attentive to that and all the details. Josh, why don't you lead us into where your thoughts are?
Yeah, so first things first. When it comes to the NMLS and renewal season, I think there's a constant theme. Prepare and go early. So hopefully by now, if we're lenders and we have licensed LOs, we've been having the conversation about the required continuing education that MLOs need to take. And keep in mind that's both MLOs who originate. It's also for people who are qualified individuals or control people that also are required to be licensed or complete continuing education in the particular states. If that conversation hasn't started already, have it now. Keep in mind that some states require that continuing education be completed earlier than others, and other states require that we actually give the submission for our renewal request quite a bit earlier than the end of the year in order for the license to remain intact next year. So quite a few things to look at. Again, MLOs and the continuing education and state processing times. Also, renewals is a really good time to look at the overall status of your company. Over the last 6-12 months, there have probably been some changes. As industry has shifted, it's likely that the internal makeup of our company has changed. So it's a really good time when we're going through renewals to look at our NMLS record, make sure it's updated, accurate, and reflects the information that we have in our other systems. The records in our HR and our LOS, that they match up with our records in the NMLS system. Really important keys there. At the same time, while it's important to do the updates, I would recommend we not make major strategy changes to the company during the renewal season. So if we're thinking about a corporate office change or a company name change or a main corporate branch address change, renewal season is not usually the best time to get those done because the same regulators that will be reviewing that advanced change requirement are the same regulators that are reviewing for renewals, and they are going to be flooded with renewals requests coming in soon. So back to that plan and go early. Hopefully we've completed those strategic type changes already, and what we're focusing on during renewal season really is primarily tied to renewals. Ray, what's some things you're thinking of?
So, a trend we will seeing now is not renewing licenses, and that's something I want to talk about too. Is there might be a thought that for in these times where we're trying to be, a lot of companies are trying to be a little bit more efficient. They might be reducing their footprint either through less loan officers in states that they used to sponsor in certain states, or the company license itself. Now, I know in the NMLS, you're able to do some of the I don't want to renew activity, but I think there's distinctions. For example, do not renew versus actually truly surrendering a company license. And so I want to talk about that. Explain to me in the NMLS, if you will, Josh, about how that works and the impact of what you think a quote not renew would look like.
Yeah, it's a great nuanced point. So within the NMLS process, when we're going to renew, particularly for MLOs, there's a checkbox we can check that says do not renew. That's the indication to the regulator that that MLO's license is not going to be renewed. The same approach really travels for branches and companies as well. However, really important to keep in mind, as Ray pointed out, it's not just the do not renew, but are there additional requirements associated with surrendering that license? Especially on the state side, and Ray, I'll have you talk to that in just a minute. There's requirements that have to be completed until or before the state approves the surrender of the license. On the MLO side, not quite as severe, but do make sure, even if you're not renewing a license or going the path of surrender, that contact information has been updated. So even if you left a company and are kind of in between companies or going to a new company, a lot of LOs end up using their company issued email address. If you're no longer with that company and no longer have access to that email address, if a regulator tries to reach out to you through that email, they're not going to reach you. So it's critically important that the contact information in your record is updated. So one of those things to keep in mind, not just on the do not renew side, but surrenders. Ray, tell me a little bit more about surrenders in the company side.
Very Thank you. So on a surrendering is a little bit different, and I see this more in the context of a company giving up their license. And I don't know if all lenders and the leadership understand what that means. And I mean, there's an idea of, you know what, we're not going to lend in that state anymore. Just don't even pay the bill for the license. It's not really the way to do it. I've had situations with some clients, either they're not going in other states, or as a company, they're shutting down altogether. In any event, what's critically important is, first of all, notifying the state that you are not going to renew the license, and in fact are surrendering the license, because each state might have there's some commonalities, but insofar as how to surrender a license might differ from state to state. Generally, what's going to happen is, first you need to inform them that you're going to surrender the license, and then the mechanization within the regulator will take from there. I will tell you that a common theme that'll necessarily be the case is going to be an expectation of record retention for a number of years. So if you look at the record retention requirement in the state, it's typically 3 years, could be five, depending on things in which state you're talking about. But there's going to be an expectation of, that's fine, you surrendered your license as of this year, and that's perfectly fine. But remember, they still have a right to examine you for the last 2 or 3 years prior to your surrender, and they haven't necessarily done that yet. So they expect to see the books and records when they do their examination in the next 6 or 9 months or whenever it is. So there's going to be an expectation that you retain the records, and the records such that it would be like a full-on audit. So it's just not just say the loan files, but it could be the accounting records and the HR records and the reports that you used. So there's going to be some expectation of record retention, and someone needs to be responsible for that, and you're going to most likely have to identify that person. There's a good chance, especially if you're surrendering the whole company, is going to be who is in charge of of actually the wind down of the company, so they know there's a contact with its consumer complaints, et cetera, in the meantime. So record retention and identifying the persons are important. There's a question I have also seen as to, particularly more in company shutdowns, this is not a deli, right? It's not a deli shop where you can just shut down and walk away. There are certain contingent liabilities that you still have, whether it's with vendors or certainly in our case, we're talking about regulators, that you must maintain. So this question as to, well, in the event that there's a breakdown in, let's say, the record retention in that period, who's responsible? Is it just the custodian? Is it the prior officer? Prior officers of the company? Is
Easy
it
for you
the
to
owners
say.
of the company? I know, right? Sorry, a lot of P's in there. I was going to say prior principal officers. That's really what it is.
More
So there, I did
alliteration.
it. But is it that? And that's a good question. We don't know where the regulators are going to look to post surrender, in the event that something happens post surrender. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I do have research that depends state to state, but I'll give you a hint. It depends on how the actual process of shutting down and surrendering, and talking about a full company now, how that really worked. And if that was done properly, then it's probably less likely. If there's arguably not properly, then maybe the clawback, who knows. But those are things to think about. And the same applies if you're surrendering in a particular state, although you're still doing business elsewhere. But you're surrendering a particular state, expect the retention requirements, the contact. It's a little bit easier when you still exist versus shutting down, but you get the idea. You can't just not renew. You can't just, I'm not going to pay the bill. You actually have to take affirmative steps for a surrender and dialogue with each state in doing that to make sure you did it correctly. So I think that's very critical to know the distinction between not going to renew, or I'm not going to pay the bill, or actual full surrender.
Just along those lines, on the NMLS, each state has a surrender checklist. Make sure to check those surrender checklists. Don't be afraid to call the regulators and ask for additional guidance. One of the other commonalities is not just for the mortgage regulator, but with the Secretary of State and the state's taxing authority. They often want an acknowledgement or a record that there are no taxes due, or that required annual reports or things like that have been filed prior to permitting the surrender of the company. I often think of states like California, who will require, under the RMLA, an independent accountant's audit of the procedures used to wind down, to verify that you don't have outstanding debt, that if you've been holding consumer money in escrow accounts, it's been dispersed properly. And I think one of the other nuances is, what kind of license do you hold? A mortgage broker versus a mortgage servicer, the expectations are going to be greater on a mortgage servicer, that there's continuity of contact, that loans being serviced have been sold, that there's a way that borrowers aren't going to be left out in the cold. really good points, and I appreciate you bringing those up.
Yeah, and you bring up one other point. Make sure you know how you have how you dispositioned all the loan files out of the system for that particular state or the whole company, depending what your situation is. Because I think that's important too. They're going to want to know. I think you brought that up. It's a good point. Did all the money go back to the borrowers or duly accounted for? You didn't walk off with the borrower's money. And in fact, did you disposition correctly? Were they left in limbo? Did you give an adverse action? They let them withdraw? What did you do? And you might want a record of that, of your pipeline, as well as to what you did with all the files, because they'll probably want to see that. So those are the types of things about shutting down. The next thing I do want to bring up, Josh, go ahead. Yeah, any final thoughts on that, and we'll switch over.
Go ahead.
Great. So the final thought I had was, and I'm coming back to continuing education, and reminding loan officers as well as lenders about the importance of completing continuing education completely properly. Why do I say that? We've had a recent, say probably in the last year or so, we've had an enforcement action, multi-state enforcement action, many of you know about, where states came back and said that loan officers were using a continuing education provider where they cut corners wrongfully and arguably illegally. And as a result, the MLOs effectively were not licensed for the education they had, and there was other things they had to agree to and do, and it got a little bit messy. So keep in mind when it comes to continuing education that the loan officers take no shortcuts, do your own education. You don't have somebody else take it for you. These are things that create risk and issues. We now see that with the enforcement action. I think we have to be cautious in how that bleeds over to lenders as well. So the question is, you can argue. The question is, if a lender knows that the loan officer or loan officers didn't complete their education properly, does the lender have liability? And that's a good question. And I think that's something you need to talk to consult about if you come up with that situation. If you know a loan officer had his assistant or her assistant take the education for them, now as a lender, do you have liability? That's a good question that needs to be resolved. And then how do you remedy that if that's in fact the case? Because arguably, not taking the education properly is equivalent to not being duly licensed because you didn't take the right steps. And there's risk in that. So keep in mind when we're talking about continuing education in light of enforcement actions as guidance, that we should be very thoughtful about keep it clean, let everyone do their education, make sure they get it right. And if you find anything otherwise, you have to consider that and consult with people to find what your next action should be. I just want to remind that when it comes to continuing ed.
I think you're spot on, Ray. And that, to me, again, goes beyond just the mortgage loan originators and up to the executives of the company. Anyone who's required to take the CE really needs to take their own CE. It's a common complaint that almost all CE education providers receive, having to complete that biosig step. It's a pain. Nobody likes doing it, but the intention is that it's actually you doing the training. By the way, to my friends at the education providers, not their fault. This is a requirement from the NMLS of all NMLS course providers to make sure to do that authentication that the person taking the training is in fact that other person. So really important key facts. One other part I would just probably end with or we'll kind of phase out. So what happens next year? There are certain states that require renewals to be approved before the end of the year in order to be originating next year. There are other states that say as long as you've submitted on time, you're authorized to keep doing business until the regulator comes back and says there's a problem. Make sure we're aware of what each state where we do business requires. Let me come back to where I started. Prepare and go early. If there's things that First Line can do to help, we'd love to. We work with clients all the time on NMLS and licensing issues and have been helping quite a few clients go through the preparation for renewals. If it's something we could do, we'd be more than happy to.
Very good, Josh. Well, thanks for that. I think we covered it. If there's any questions on that, like you said, you can always reach out to us or somebody. Josh, how do you want to close it out?
As I usually do, subscribe, rate, and review. Thanks for joining. We'll see you again next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.